François, welcome to DIAS, and it's good to have you. And thank you for doing a lecture for us the other day, which was hugely successful.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Obviously, François, you're challenging us to think about communication in ways that are unusual for most of us. So I would tend to think of communication as something I intend to communicate in order to achieve something. But you think much more broadly about this. Could you give us a sense of where you are?
Yes, exactly. But I'm trying to talk about communication. In the way we tend to use it in daily conversations almost. Because, for example, I'm just giving you a very simple example. When you are showing someone a house, for example, and you're trying to sell this house, you're going to say, oh, and this kitchen communicates with his other room. You're going to use the term communicate. To what do you mean when we say that? You just mean that this kitchen is basically having an access to this other room through a doorway. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you could say, well, yes, but that's a very weird way of using communication. But at the same time, we are using this term to speak about this connection between two rooms. And I think that's because, in a way, communication in its most basic sense is about relating two beings with each other, okay? Two rooms, but it's also two people. We are communicating. For example, I'm trying to share my ideas with you, and you could agree with them or not. Even when we speak about human communication, if I'm starting to blush, for example, that's not something I control, probably blushing, and it's going to communicate a form of embarrassment on my part, for example. And I'd like to, let's say, to hide it, but I cannot help it. So we see that communication is much more than intentional communication. It's about things that happen and that basically get shared with other beings, and that's what interests me. This idea of sharing, and that's why I try to defend a very broad conception of communication, because I think it's important to even think about human communication. That is, to have an interesting conception of what human communication is about.
So it's very relational, it's
Exactly.
very emergent, it's very complex in relation to how I would normally understand communication as something very actor-specific, very intentional. But would you say that communication then is always emergent? Or can it also be something that is designed and subject to control?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm not saying that we are not good at communicating, at trying to control what people are understanding. I'm just saying that we are in many respects unable to control everything. I might, for example, I have no idea how I'm coming across as, I'm trying to control the way, for example, I hope I'm coming across as, knowledgeable about what I'm talking about. Maybe not, who knows, because I'm completely at your mercy for that, or at the mercy of people who are listening to me. So, that's the thing that I can try to, for sure, and I'm trying to control this aspect, to try to do everything I can to make myself understandable. But at the same time, the control is limited, and we are, that's something I like to insist on. We can be surprised by the way we come across as, for example, it already happened maybe to you, but it certainly happened to me that I insulted someone without meaning to, really without meaning to, and I insulted that person. So it means that even if I try to control and I try to be a good guy or whatever, things suddenly, take a different turn because I came across as, not having good intention. Why it was not the case at all. Maybe, in other situations it was the case. I wanted to hurt someone, but I just want to insist that communication is much broader also in terms of human communication. It's much broader than just, what we intend to communicate, because this idea of we can always be surprised, by what,
But one of the things that interests me when I hear people like you speak is, how does this conception of communication enable us to think about liberation and domination? Because in my mind, communication can both be an opening. It can open new horizons. It can liberate us from old ideas and bring us forward. But it can also be about establishing dominance.
Yeah.
You know, this is the way it is, and we're not going to talk about other things.
Yeah, yeah.
So how do you
well,
approach those two?
One way I address that in my work is, especially in terms of dominance, or I try to use the term, I'm using the term authority. You know, authority is an important term to explain power, you know, because authority is a form of power. There are forms of power that are nothing to do with authority, like, for example, a threat or you know, physical violence and so on. But in terms of domination and by what we say or by what we show, then authority is important. And authority is a lot about, you know, sources of justification, sources of precisely of authority. And so I'm showing that basically when we try to become more authoritative, so to speak, we try to multiply the authors of what we are saying. I could be accused of playing with words, but I think it's not only playing with words. Is that, you know, when I say, for example, you're wrong because this is not what the literature is saying, I'm basically what I call ventriloquizing the literature. That is, I'm making the literature say something that I'm also saying, that I claim to be saying also. So I become more authoritative, you know. That's usually how experts are, you know, establishing their dominance, for example. So that's the way we, I think, create dominance. But there are other forms of dialogues or interactions that are more, I would say, oriented to mutual comprehension, where we try to not necessarily establish power move. You know, we can also, as you said, I like what you're saying about the liberation. You know, we try to liberate the person to some extent.
You and I, we're employed at universities.
Yeah.
We sit in a university building. We're communicating, presumably now, also to university people.
Yeah.
And we like to think of ourselves as scholars who open minds, who enlighten, who liberate. But as you said, we also mobilize literature, authority to establish the authority of our voice.
Yeah.
Well, what should be the role of universities more broadly in driving new ideas in society, and doing this in a way that liberates and avoiding the trap of power moves?
Yeah, power move. But first, we might need to speak a little bit more to society, in a sense that we speak to society through our students mostly. I mean, obviously, it's not the case now because hopefully this talk will be diffused in other situations. But you know, I think it's a first maybe step. The problem is that this step is not always encouraged by our institutions, because even by our peers, actually, because our peers are, you know, they value, and it's normal to some extent, they value scholarly work, you know, they value publications, they value conferences, they value, you know, basically, what, when we talk to each other as scholars. But I think, you know, there are some of us who are sometimes taking the risk or sometimes enjoying talking to the public, you know, and is it liberating? Well, you know, maybe it's pretentious on our part, but hopefully, you know, we have also, you know, to be aware of what we represent, of what the kind of knowledge we accumulated, that we think we have, and possibly, you know, try to convey it, and I hope, yeah, as a form of liberation, as a way to think with more complexity about problems, you know. Try to call into question what is taken for granted by many people.
So would it be fair to say that as a policy advice, you would suggest that universities become more oriented towards societal engagement?
I think so. I mean, we need to be, because we know, unfortunately, that you know, there are many people who are wary of universities. You know, they think that universities are you know, basically ideological, and that they to some extent, are deceiving the population. I mean, sometimes there is this kind of discourse that we see a lot, especially through social media, but not only. And I think it's important that we remind population, that universities, they are made of people like you and me, the university is going to be made of your daughters and sons and so on, and they are not, people who are detached from society. They are people who devote their lives to knowledge, to the building of knowledge, and they have to be, I think, heard for that. It doesn't mean that they are the only people to be heard. Obviously, politicians are others, populations, and so on and so forth, and also NGOs and militants and so on and so on. But we have something to say. We have something to say about, not only in terms of ideas, but also in terms of, facts, in terms of what we believe to be true, in terms of how we represent what is happening in a specific situation. We have, devote our lives to that. So I think we need to defend this idea of the university, I think, of research. It's important.
Finally, François, to the viewers who have been inspired by what you've been saying, if you could recommend one book that they should pick up and read for their inspiration, what would that be?
There is a book I really love. It's an old book, relatively. It's not that old. It's 26 years old now, 27. It's in 1999. It's written by John Durham Peters, and it's called Into the Air. And the subtitle is that it's a history of the idea of communication, and it's a wonderful book that shows history. Precisely, we were talking about that at the beginning. The history of how we conceive of communication, and it's very well written, and it's also it demonstrates an incredible knowledge by this person who works currently at Yale.
That's great, François. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.